Today is a day of wailing, of sorrow. It is International Holocaust Remembrance Day, not a holiday, but a day of lamentation for millions of Jews and their lives that were lost. 6 million horrifyingly massacred in one of the worst genocides in human history by the Nazi regime simply because they were Jewish, including 5 million other people who were executed because they were undesirables, according to the Nazi regime that dominated Germany during the 1930s and caused the Second World War, which almost destroyed the West. In horrifying ways, Jews were rounded up, shot in killing pits, gassed in vans, put in trains, and sent to terrible places like Auschwitz, Treblinka, Buchenwald, and others. And there they were either killed or worked to death. They were malnourished, underfed, harassed, abused, and all sorts of other horrible crimes were committed against them, all in the name of ethnic cleansing and racial purification, all in the name of hatred. And the most surprising and horrifying thing, perhaps, beyond all the death and despair and destruction, is the fact that so many, especially in the West, who were fighting the Nazis admirably during the war, did not know just how far the Fuhrer, Adolf Hitler, and his goons had gone in the systematic destruction of the Jewish people of Europe and others whom they deemed unworthy. Hitler came to power in the 1930s, using tactics of blame and shame in order to gain power. He blamed the loss of World War I and Germany's current problems on the Jews and on the communists and on any enemy of the state. Rather than taking personal accountability into question, Hitler stoked the fires through his charisma and anger, and through producing large amounts of negative energy, he turned the German country into a whipped-up army ready to fight and kill. But this was not new. Anti-Semitism is part of European history. Indeed, it is part of world history. The Jews of Europe had suffered greatly at the hands of the Spanish Inquisition, the Crusades, and other things. They had failed to assimilate the way the Europeans had wanted, both the Catholic Church and many kingdoms. And because they were blamed for the murder of Christ, they were often primary targets during the medieval and early modern period, especially in Germany. Martin Luther, the reformer who created the Lutheran Church, which so sold out its values to join the Nazi cause, though some resisted, was a horrifying anti-Semite whose last works encouraged the burning and destruction of Jewish homes, property, and livelihoods, something that Hitler and the Nazis were all too familiar with, rounding up Jews from all over Europe and, yes, the Middle East, working with the Grand Mufti in the Palestinian region to round up Jews in the Middle East. Nazi propaganda depicted the right people. The right people were blonde-haired, blue-eyed Germans, Aryans, the people, the Übermensch. The enemy were the communists and the Jews, the real fault of their loss in World War I, and the most horrifying people imaginable. Through this pattern of demonization and negative energy and hatred, Hitler stoked the fires of mass execution and genocide. Starting with the Nuremberg laws of 1935 and the wearing of Jewish stars to identify them, the Jews saw their rights and privileges stripped away. One of the most audacious atrocities committed during this time was Kristallnacht in November of 1938, where Jewish homes and businesses and synagogues were destroyed, Torahs were burned, livelihoods were taken away, women were abused in the most horrifying and graphic of ways, and men were killed, as the Nazis rendered violence upon the people who they blamed for all of their problems. At the same time, their hatred only grew further. Many of the Nazi high command, especially Hitler himself, wanted to systematically either expunge or exterminate the Jewish people, desecrating their livelihoods, destroying their religious books. At the same time, the desecration of religious items, the segregation of the Jews, their punishment and persecution was not good enough for the Nazis. They sought the entire extermination of the Jewish people, and even segregating them in ghettos like the Warsaw one in Poland, as the Germans conquered that land at the beginning of World War II, was not good enough for them. Systematic destruction in the face of such a powerful military force was the only thing that would do. They abandoned their plans of sending the Jews to Africa, namely Madagascar, when the French Empire refused. But in a stain upon French history, the French coalesced with the Nazis, turning over Jews left and right, while the Italians, of all people, despite being allies, the fascists under Mussolini, hid Jews as much as they could. Brave stories of people like Oskar Schindler and Corrie ten Boom hiding Jews perpetrated throughout the Holocaust. However, the Nazi war machine and the systematic destruction of the Jewish people marched on. And if it wasn't Hitler, then it was up to Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, the Nazi elite forces, to persecute the Jewish people. Himmler organized a plan. Known as the Final Solution, it was finally introduced in 1941. It decided that instead of expungement, the Jews would be subject to destruction. Killing pits were already common, where Jews were buried in mass, shallow graves, murdered by people like Adolf Eichmann and his striking brigade. However, in order to cover up their atrocities and kill in a systematic fashion, they needed to round up the Jews, putting them on trains and sending them to concentration camps. Millions of Jews all throughout Europe and even the Middle East were sent there, along with communists, homosexuals, people with mental disabilities, Slavs, and Romani gypsies. This was the beginning of the Holocaust. These concentration camps were split into two different types. A work camp where Jews were either exterminated or given into hard labor, where upon them becoming too weak due to malnutrition they would be killed, or killing camps where they simply arrived and were gassed and their remains burned to hide the atrocities of the Nazis. Burning the corpses was a way in which to eliminate the memory of the Jewish people. They were tattooed with numbers, of which the many who survived the Holocaust, albeit scarred forever, carried until their dying day, and many who still survived it carried it as well. Auschwitz was probably the most well-known one, with 1.3 million Jews dying there, hundreds of thousands given over to hard labor in terrifying, horrid conditions. Women were usually taken advantage of, men were beaten, and all sorts of atrocities were committed. At the same time, the Nazis did horrific experiments. Dr. Joseph Mengele, who does not even deserve to be called a physician, committed some of the worst atrocities and experiments on men, women, children, boys, girls, the elderly. It did not matter. They were all subject to terrifying experiments, and those who did not survive were killed. And those who did survive were often worked to death until they were killed. And still many went through the places of Treblinka and Auschwitz dying. At the same time, despite the growing atrocities, the Nazis were not done. With many of the camps being in Poland, and with many of the Jews being killed of Eastern European descent, the idea amongst the Nazis was to find all the Jews they possibly could and exterminate them, removing what they believed the stain of the vermin to be. And yet, through all of this, the Jewish people persisted. But the cost was heavy, the burden overwhelming, the disaster, devastation, and destruction unimaginable. The Holocaust is not 6 million deaths. It is 1 plus 1 plus 1 until you can count all the way up. Yet hope, as foreign and limp as it certainly was coming. The Soviets pushed the Germans out of Russia, advancing into Poland, and there they found the human atrocities of the Holocaust, liberating Auschwitz-Birkenau on January 27, 1945, 80 years ago today, in which that is the occasion for this remembrance and lamentation. The atrocities they found scarred the entire world, and there was secrets and rumors. People had heard of things. High-ranking government officials might have known of some of the concepts. However, the extent and the horror, those remaining and the remains of those who had been killed, stunned the entire world then, as they do now, even 80 years later. More and more camps were liberated by the Allies, and the war wrapped up. Hitler killed himself in his bunker on April 30th, and 8 days later, the Germans surrendered. Himmler was arrested and later committed suicide through poison, as did many of the Nazi high command, while Mengele was able to flee to South America, where he lived. Eichmann was eventually hunted down by the Israelis and executed in 1961, as the Mossad, CIA, and other intelligence operations did everything they could to track down Nazi butchers who had somehow escaped the trials of Nuremberg, where the Nazi high command were put on trial for their crimes against humanity in one of the most frightening and shocking trials in human history, where many of them were convicted to death and either committed suicide or were executed. Yet these efforts were of little consolation to those who had suffered so much. It was of little consolation to those who had kept their lives but had suffered mightily, while it was even less consolation to those who had died and their families. Nothing could be brought back. Questions about humanity, the meaning of life, surfaced, and instantly, not only the Jewish people, but Western Europe and the United States and the Soviets, which had bungled responding to this crisis, which had ignored signs and warnings about the atrocities of the Nazis, did everything they could to remedy the situation and to make amends. In the wake of such brutality and history of anti-Semitism prominent in Europe and even the United States, as well as the Soviet Union, the UN decided to give the Jews a state, a land flowing with milk and honey, where they could run themselves, have their own government, and not be bothered by other powers. This led to the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. At the same time, the Jewish community, the survivors of the Holocaust, Israelis or otherwise, did everything in their power, along with the help of the international community, to make sure that everyone remembered what had transpired, and the phrase "never again" became the most powerful in all of Jewish culture. It is a sad and overwhelmingly horrid fact that "never again" carries such power even today as it did then. Museums, memorials, and markers line the streets of major cities, even in Berlin, where nearly 3,000 slabs contain the Holocaust Memorial, where 3 million names are written down. Meanwhile, media, books, and other writings such as Ali Wiesel, A Holocaust Survival's Account, Night, The Diary of Anne Frank, one of the most powerful stories of a young girl in human history, and the graphic novel Maus all detail the horrors and the suffering of the Jewish people and others. These memorials and writings, frequently seen all over the world, particularly in the West, carry a poignant and powerful message surrounding the Jewish people and the other victims. That this history must be put to memory, it must be remembered, it must be cried over and wept over for as long as it continues to be discrimination, racism, and hatred. And that those who wish to learn this horrible story will learn it, put to memory, and make sure that it never reoccurs.